Welcome back to Conversations at JGU. Today, I'm joined by Professor Dr. Upasana Mahanta, who has a BA from Miranda House, University of Delhi, an MA from the University of Delhi, as well as a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She's also been a Shastri Doctoral Scholar in the Center for Women and Gender Studies at the University of British Columbia in Canada. At the Jindal Global Law School, she teaches a number of courses centering around women's studies. Welcome to the show, Upasana. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
All right.
Pleasure.
So, Upasana, you've been a scholar in women's studies for, so many years now, right? What I wanted to talk to you about today is to look at the pandemic through a gendered lens. When we're talking about the pandemic, we're talking about lives lost, we're talking about lack of healthcare or ICU beds or oxygen or job losses. But has the pandemic affected men and women separately or differently?
Well, yes, it has. We all live gendered lives, and this is something that we have spoken about earlier as well, that, there are pre-existing inequities in society. So what the pandemic has done, which we are trying to call this new normal, it's not that it has led to these inequities. In some cases it has. Perhaps facilitated the existing inequities, but at the same time what it has done is also exposed certain pre-existing inequities,
Right.
Made it sort of more possible for us
Right.
to observe them in ways that we have not done it.
So let's start with the private economy and let's start with unemployment, right? Traditionally in every sense of the term, men are supposed to be breadwinners, women stay back at home. Of course, that is changing in certain areas. But has the pandemic and its associated loss of employment, has that affected women differently than men?
It has. So in many ways, it has affected women differently than men. So if I talk about the second wave, it is believed that in the 2 months of the second wave, more than 17 million jobs were lost. Now, if that is the case, it has disproportionately impacted jobs where largely women are employed.
Right.
And by that, I mean largely informal sectors where women are employed, right?
Why do you think that is? Why would you say that is?
As to why the informal sector has impacted more, or women are,
Why is it in the informal sector more?
because it is easy to, because there are no formal contracts largely, it is easy to let them go. For example, say domestic work.
Right.
So once the pandemic hit and there is a fear of others coming into your house, the first people you let go are your domestic help, right? And you know that there is large-scale feminization of domestic work in India, right? So that means those are the first people to let go, and the last one to come back in, right? So their informal sector impacts, disproportionately gets impacted, and in that women get disproportionately impacted more. For instance, one of the studies that McKinsey had done, it says that the job loss for women was 1.8 times higher
1.8.
than the job loss for men.
Right.
And so you see the disproportionate impact there itself. And the other thing that had happened due to the pandemic, because we sort of withdrew from public spaces, offices and public spaces, and gone back inside the home.
Right.
Right. And the moment we gone back inside the home, women who were working, who had positions in the formal sector as well, now had to bear the burden of doing the work and also doing
being
the
at
household
home.
work.
Right.
You know that the domestic help are not coming in.
Correct.
Right. Now, as it is, women are bearing a disproportionate burden of unpaid care work. Right. Cooking, cleaning, taking care of the household, elderly, children,
Right.
everything. But now, on top of that, because there are no other help and you're confined to the house, now you're expected to also fulfill the responsibilities of the home and work, because the home space has also become the work.
So let's talk about the home space a little bit, and we've been in some sense of isolation in some form or the other, whether it's central government mandated or state government mandated or self-imposed, right? Now, when we're living in a small household unit in isolation, again, the same question arises: does that impact men and women differently?
It does. Again, we have to go back to the pre-existing inequities in society, right? You know that there is sexual division of labor, right? Household responsibilities, although we would like to be, are not shared responsibilities, right? So the burden is on women more. So even if it is a smaller family unit or a larger family unit, it is the women who are taking care of the unpaid care work within the household. Now, the second thing that happens, which you've actually said earlier, is this whole construction around men being the breadwinners, right? And so the job loss also impacts men and women differently.
Right.
So a man who is unable to, say, earn for the family anymore, there are frustrations, there is anger, there is dissatisfaction, and a lot of that gets translated into some kind of violence that happens within the home.
So would you believe that there's been an increase in domestic violence during the pandemic?
Certainly, globally, and also in India as well, because we've seen during the pandemic, National Commission for Women and CW came out with a report saying that the distress calls to the organization, to the commission, had increased manyfold during the pandemic. Women seeking help, women who were, suffering from abuse within the household. So it certainly has increased. So what it has done is that we know that the private sphere of the home is not necessarily an altruistic sphere, right?
True.
Although there is an understanding that, family, everybody is together, and you know that it is a sphere where power operates in very many different ways. What the pandemic has done, it has made us realize how, volatile and vulnerable women can be within that.
Right. So would it be possible to say that, even as a victim of domestic abuse, where I would have the right and the ability to walk out of my domestic home, that right of walking out has also been curtailed?
Well, in so many ways. One is that the entire right of walking out of the house is going away. The pandemic forces you to stay inside. But at the same time, with the lack of financial independence, with lack of any kind of access to resources, with the stress of children, elderly in the household, family members. So it becomes all the more difficult at this point of time to take the decision, not only to walk out, even to file a complaint or to make a distress call becomes extremely difficult.
So Upasana, gender inequities are systemic. They're deeply rooted in society, right? And you and I are both part of the Jindal Global University. So one final question. What role do you see higher education playing in removing these gender inequities?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. I think higher education does, and I'm thinking aloud here,
Sure.
I think does two things. One is, of course, it prepares you for the outside world. It makes you eligible to be financially independent, whether you are a man or a woman or any other gender that you conform to or not. But what also higher education does, and it must do, is to teach you to be self-reflexive, I think. And I think that is a very, very important thing to be able to do, especially in a space like Jindal, where, you have come to study in a higher education space, particularly in a university like this, because there are already certain privileges that you have.
Right.
In terms of, the possibility of seeking higher education, in terms of having
access,
the resources to have an access and so on and so forth. But at the same time, to be aware of that location and to be self-reflexive and to be responsive towards the people and the society in and around you is very, very important. For example, I would want my students to reflect on the fact as to whether, the domestic help that is coming into their house is being paid when there is a lockdown, right? Are you calling up and finding out how they're doing? Is there a sense of responsibility? I mean, I'm not talking about going out and working. Of course, those who are, you must. But what are the little things that we are doing every day that can make a difference?
So to be more responsible and reflective upon how others' lives are led.
Absolutely. And how our lives at the end of the day, if the pandemic has taught us anything, I mean, it's made us more and more isolated. But at the same time, it's told us how codependent we are, right? How what happens to one of us can impact so many others. And I think that, that learning is something to be really, really taken seriously.
So I think that's a key takeaway from this. So we are living, even while we are living in isolation, we are also dependent upon others for our well-being. All right, so that has been a really interesting conversation at JGU with Professor Upasana Mahanta. Feel free to join us the next time on other conversations at JGU.